Most empires end loudly, in fire and defeat, but this story begins with an empire that seemed to fade away instead. Welcome, and thank you for being here. As you settle in, feel free to leave a quiet comment sharing where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Then you can simply relax, listen, and let this story unfold slowly, one calm moment at a time. Throughout most of recorded history, empires announce their endings in unmistakable ways. They fall in wars that echo across generations, in battles that become reference points, in dates that are memorized and repeated until they harden into certainty. The collapse of an empire is often dramatic, violent, and final, at least in the way it's remembered. Armies clash, cities change hands, flags are lowered, and new rulers proclaim the end of an old order. History textbooks are comfortable with this kind of ending because it feels complete. There is a sense of closure, a final chapter that neatly explains what came before and what followed after. When historians study the downfall of imperial powers, they tend to look for familiar signs. Military overstretch is one of them, when armies are spread too thin across distant frontiers. Economic strain is another, when the cost of maintaining control begins to outweigh the benefits of empire. Internal divisions, rebellions, and rival claimants to power often accelerate decline. And almost always, somewhere near the end, there is war. Sometimes it is a civil war, sometimes an invasion from outside, sometimes a long sequence of conflicts that erode strength over decades. But conflict, in one form or another, is usually present. Because of this pattern, we come to expect war as the punctuation mark of empire. Without it, the story feels unfinished. An empire that doesn't end in battle can feel unsettling, almost suspicious, as though something important has been left out. Yet history does not always conform to our expectations, and power does not always change hands in ways that are dramatic or easy to see. There are moments when empires do not fall so much as they thin out. Their authority weakens gradually, their borders blur, and their influence dissolves into something quieter. Administrative systems replace armies, treaties replace sieges. Local governance replaces distant imperial oversight. In these cases, there may be no single moment that feels like an ending. Instead, there is a long, slow transition that is difficult to capture in a single sentence or date. This is where the story of Tartaria becomes interesting from a war history perspective. The mystery is not that a powerful empire was destroyed without resistance, but rather that what people imagine as an empire may never have existed in the way we expect empires to exist. And because there was no final battle, no surrender, and no global conflict to mark its disappearance, the name itself simply faded from use. War history often focuses on moments of violence because they are easier to document. Battles leave records. Armies leave trails of correspondence, supply lists, casualty reports, and treaties. Quiet change, by contrast, leaves far less behind. When authority shifts without fighting, it may barely register at all in the historical record, especially from the perspective of those living far away. As we move through this story, it's helpful to set aside the expectation of a dramatic collapse. Instead, this is a history of power changing shape. It is a story about how military strength can sometimes prevent war rather than cause it, and how vast regions can be absorbed, redefined, and renamed without a single decisive conflict that everyone agrees was the end. This is not the story of a forgotten war. It is the story of a war that never happened, and what that absence tells us about how empires truly fade. To understand why Tartaria seems to vanish from history, it helps to begin not with armies or rulers, but with maps. Early modern maps were not precise instruments in the way we understand them today. They were interpretations, shaped by limited information, second-hand accounts, and the long distances that separated European mapmakers from the lands they attempted to describe. When cartographers labelled vast regions of northern and central Asia as Tartaria, they were not identifying a unified empire. They were naming the unknown. For centuries, European knowledge of the Eurasian interior was fragmented. Travellers returned with stories rather than measurements. Merchants followed routes, but rarely surveyed the land beyond them. Diplomats encountered courts and rulers, but seldom explored beyond political centres. As a result, large portions of Asia appeared on maps as broad, vaguely defined spaces. Tartaria became a convenient label for these regions, much like Africa or the Orient had once been used as generalized terms rather than precise descriptions. The word itself derived from Tatar, a name Europeans applied broadly to various nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples of the steppe. Over time, this label expanded far beyond its original meaning. Tartaria came to represent not a single state, but a collection of lands inhabited by many different groups, languages, and political systems. Some areas were governed by khanates, others by tribal confederations, and still others by empires that Europeans only partially understood. Importantly, early maps were not neutral documents. They reflected the priorities and assumptions of the societies that produced them. European cartographers were often more interested in coastlines, trade routes, and political borders that affected diplomacy or commerce. Regions beyond these interests were simplified. Tartaria filled the empty spaces on the map, serving as a placeholder for lands that were real but not yet fully known. As centuries passed, exploration, diplomacy, and military campaigns gradually increased European understanding of the Eurasian interior. Surveying techniques improved. Borders became more clearly defined. Political entities were named and renamed as alliances shifted and empires expanded. In this process, the usefulness of the term Tartaria began to fade. It was not erased so much as replaced by more specific names that reflected a deeper understanding of the region. This transition did not require a war because it was not a political event. It was an intellectual and administrative one. As mapmakers gained better information, they refined their language. Where once there had been a single broad label, there were now many. Tartaria gave way to Siberia, Central Asia, Manchuria, Mongolia, and other regions with clearer geographic and political identities. From a distance, this can look like disappearance. A name that once covered half a continent slowly vanishes from maps, and without context, it feels as though something enormous has been lost. But in reality, what disappeared was not a civilization, but a way of describing space. The land did not change, the people did not vanish, only the map did. In war history, maps are often treated as background material, tools that illustrate campaigns and borders, but they are also powerful shapers of perception. When a name disappears from a map, it can feel like the end of a story, even if the story itself continues under different terms. Tartaria's vanishing begins here, not on a battlefield, but at a drafting table, where knowledge slowly replaced uncertainty. Long before Tartaria appeared on European maps, the Eurasian steppe had shaped the course of military history. This vast belt of grassland, stretching from Eastern Europe to East Asia, produced societies whose relationship to war was deeply influenced by movement, environment, and survival. Life on the steppe required adaptability, and that adaptability translated into a distinctive form of military power. Steppe societies often relied on mobility rather than fortification. Horses were central, not just as tools of war, but as foundations of daily life. This created armies that could move quickly, strike unexpectedly, and withdraw before an enemy could respond. From the perspective of settled agricultural states, this kind of warfare was difficult to counter. Borders were hard to defend against an opponent who did not rely on fixed positions. Because of this, steppe power often functioned as deterrence. The mere possibility of a raid or invasion could shape the behavior of neighboring states. Diplomacy, tribute, and alliances frequently replaced open conflict because war against mobile forces was costly and uncertain. In many cases, it was easier to accommodate steppe powers than to confront them directly. This dynamic complicates the way we think about war. Not all military power expresses itself through constant fighting. Sometimes, strength is demonstrated through restraint. The threat of force can be enough to secure influence without the need for repeated battles. Over time, this can lead to a kind of quiet dominance that leaves few dramatic moments for historians to record. The steppe world was not unified, and it never functioned as a single empire for long. Alliances shifted, confederations formed and dissolved. Leaders rose and fell. Yet from the outside, especially to distant observers, these changes could appear as continuity. European travellers and chroniclers often described the steppe as a single, vast domain because its internal distinctions were invisible to them. This perception fed directly into the idea of Tartaria as a coherent entity. When maps labelled the region as a single space, they reflected an outsider's view, shaped by distance and limited contact. Internally, however, the steppe was dynamic, complex, and constantly changing. Power moved through relationships rather than borders, and influence was measured in allegiance rather than territory. As neighbouring empires expanded, they did not always conquer the steppe through decisive wars. Instead, they absorbed it gradually. Military outposts appeared, trade routes were regulated, local leaders were incorporated into larger administrative systems. Over time, the balance of power shifted, not through a final clash, but through accumulation. This process left little room for a dramatic ending. There was no last stand, no decisive defeat. The steppe did not collapse, it transformed. Its military traditions influenced the empires that absorbed it, even as those empires imposed new structures in return. War, in this context, was less about destruction and more about negotiation, adaptation, and slow change. By the time Tartaria faded from maps, the military world that had once inspired the term had already evolved. The absence of a global war was not an anomaly. It was the result of centuries of gradual shifts in power that never required a single defining conflict to resolve. When historians look for the roots of Tartaria in war history, they often arrive at the memory of the Mongol era. This period did not create Tartaria as a state, but it shaped how outsiders imagined the lands of the steppe for centuries afterward. The Mongol expansion left an impression so powerful that even long after its political unity dissolved, the idea of a vast, interconnected Inner Asia lingered in European thought. The Mongol Empire was remarkable not only for its scale, but for its speed. Within a few generations, Mongol forces had connected regions that had previously seemed distant and unrelated. Roads were secured, messengers travelled across enormous distances, and systems of tribute and governance extended far beyond what most medieval states could manage. From a military perspective, this was an extraordinary achievement, built on organisation, discipline, and an understanding of movement that suited the steppe environment. Yet even at its height, the Mongol Empire was not a single, uniform entity. Authority depended heavily on personal loyalty, family ties, and negotiated power. As generations passed, this structure became increasingly difficult to maintain. The empire fractured into khanates, each adapting to local conditions and priorities. Some became more sedentary, adopting administrative practices from neighboring civilizations. Others retained more traditional steppe ways of life. Over time, the unified military force that had once terrified much of Eurasia became a constellation of regional powers. For European observers, these internal changes were not always clear. News travelled slowly, and the distinctions between one khanate and another were often lost in translation. What remained was a generalized memory of Mongol dominance, projected backward and outward onto maps and narratives. Tartaria became, in part, a shorthand for this remembered power, a name that carried echoes of military strength even after the reality had changed. This lingering perception mattered. It influenced how European states approached diplomacy, trade, and expansion in Asia. The fear of provoking a unified steppe response often encouraged caution. Military planners imagined threats that no longer existed in the same form, while administrators treated vast regions as if they were still governed by a single authority. In this way, the memory of Mongol power helped prevent war as much as it inspired it. As time passed, the khanates themselves evolved. Some were absorbed into expanding empires. Others declined through internal struggles, economic shifts, or changes in trade routes. These processes were often gradual and uneven. There was rarely a moment when one could say with certainty that the Mongol legacy had ended. Instead, it faded into the background of history, influencing structures and traditions long after its political form disappeared. This slow fading complicates the search for a clear ending. The Mongol era did not conclude with a single decisive war that marked the end of steppe dominance across Eurasia. Instead, its influence was diluted over time, reshaped by new powers and new priorities. Tartaria, as a concept, absorbed this ambiguity. It became a container for historical memory rather than a reflection of present reality. From a war history perspective, this matters because it shows how military dominance can outlast the armies that created it. The fear and respect inspired by the Mongols persisted long after their political unity was gone. This legacy shaped decisions, delayed conflicts, and influenced how power was exercised across borders. The absence of a final war was not a mystery, but a consequence of how deeply the memory of conquest had settled into the collective imagination. In many histories, war is portrayed as the ultimate arbiter of power. Battles decide borders, victories crown rulers, and defeats end eras. But there are times when power shifts without a final confrontation, when the outcome is decided long before armies would ever meet on a battlefield. Tartaria's disappearance fits this quieter pattern. Power can be exercised in many ways. Military force is one of them, but it is not always the most visible. Control over trade routes, access to resources, and administrative authority can reshape regions more effectively than open conflict. When these forces align, war becomes unnecessary, not because peace prevails, but because resistance becomes impractical. In the lands once labelled as Tartaria, this kind of shift unfolded over centuries. Expanding empires established forts, settlements, and systems of governance. They mapped territories, collected taxes, and regulated movement. Local leaders were incorporated into imperial hierarchies, their authority preserved in exchange for loyalty. Over time, the need for large-scale military action diminished, replaced by routines of administration. This process rarely produces a dramatic narrative. There is no final stand, no decisive defeat. Instead, authority changes hands gradually, often without disrupting daily life. From the perspective of ordinary people, these changes may have felt subtle. New officials arrived. New laws were introduced. Borders that had once been fluid became fixed. Yet life continued, shaped more by seasons and local concerns than by distant political shifts. From the outside, however, this gradual absorption can appear as disappearance. When a region is no longer labelled as a single entity, when its name fades from maps and texts, it can feel as though it has been erased. In reality, it has been redefined. The power that once held it together has been replaced by structures that are less visible but more enduring. War historians sometimes overlook these transitions because they lack clear moments of conflict. Yet they are just as significant as battles. The ability to absorb territory without fighting reflects a form of dominance that is both efficient and lasting. It suggests that the outcome of war is not always decided by combat, but by the systems that follow it. In the case of Tartaria, the absence of a final battle does not indicate peace in the modern sense. It indicates that the balance of power had shifted so thoroughly that war was no longer required. The region's fate was decided not by a clash of armies, but by the slow accumulation of control. This kind of ending challenges our expectations. We want empires to fall with noise and clarity. We want dates and names and decisive moments. But history does not always oblige. Sometimes, power slips away quietly, leaving behind questions rather than conclusions. The disappearance of Tartaria from maps coincided with the expansion of neighbouring empires that advanced not in sudden conquests, but in measured steps. These advances were supported by military presence, but they were defined more by endurance than by spectacle. Forts replaced armies, administrators replaced generals. Over time, the frontier moved without ever erupting into a global war. This kind of expansion required patience. Roads were built. Supply lines were secured. Settlements were encouraged. Each step reinforced the next, creating a network of control that could be maintained with relatively small forces. Resistance, when it occurred, was often localized and short-lived, resolved without drawing international attention. From a military standpoint, this approach was highly effective. It minimized risk, conserved resources, and reduced the likelihood of large-scale conflict. By avoiding decisive battles, expanding empires avoided the unpredictability of war. Instead, they relied on stability and continuity, allowing their influence to grow steadily. For the regions involved, this meant that change arrived slowly. There was no single year when everything shifted. Authority accumulated over decades, sometimes centuries. Borders hardened gradually, shaped by treaties, surveys, and agreements, rather than by victory on the battlefield. This process helps explain why Tartaria lacks a clear endpoint. There was no moment when an empire fell, because there was no empire in the conventional sense to fall. What existed instead was a broad region defined by geography and perception, gradually absorbed into more clearly defined political units. The absence of a global war is not evidence of erasure. It is evidence of a different kind of power, one that expands quietly, reshapes landscapes through governance, and leaves behind few dramatic markers for historians to follow. As we move forward, we'll turn our attention to how this quiet transformation was reflected in maps themselves, and why the disappearance of a name can feel so much like the disappearance of a civilization. Maps do more than show geography. They quietly shape how people understand the world. often without drawing attention to themselves. For centuries, the way land was labelled on maps influenced how regions were imagined, discussed, and remembered. Tartaria's disappearance begins to make sense when we slow down and look closely at how maps themselves changed over time, not suddenly, but in a gradual and almost unnoticeable way. Early maps were not precise instruments. They were compilations of stories, second-hand accounts, and educated guesses. Vast spaces were difficult to measure, and when information was incomplete, mapmakers filled in the gaps with broad labels. Tartaria served exactly this purpose. It represented a wide, loosely understood region that lay beyond the daily experience of most Europeans. Its boundaries were flexible, shifting slightly from one map to the next, depending on who had drawn it and what sources they had consulted. As exploration increased and states invested more resources into surveying land, the nature of maps began to change. Measurement replaced approximation. Longitude and latitude became more accurate. Borders were no longer sketched as soft edges, but drawn as lines, sometimes rigid, sometimes contested, but increasingly specific. With this shift came a need for new language. Broad regional names like Tartaria were no longer sufficient to describe what mapmakers could now see in greater detail. This process did not happen all at once. For decades, even centuries, old and new ideas coexisted. Some maps continued to use Tartaria while also introducing smaller regional names within it. Others removed the term entirely, replacing it with labels that reflected emerging political realities. There was no announcement, no official decree stating that Tartaria no longer existed. The name simply appeared less often, until eventually it disappeared from common usage. From a war history perspective, this matters because maps are often treated as evidence of political power. When a name vanishes, it can feel like a conquest has occurred, even when no battle took place. In reality, the disappearance of Tartaria from maps reflects a shift in understanding rather than a shift in sovereignty. Knowledge expanded, and the map adjusted accordingly. This adjustment can feel unsettling because it lacks drama. There is no story of armies advancing or cities falling. Instead, there is the quiet replacement of one way of seeing the world with another. Over time, people stopped thinking of the region as a single space and began to think of it as many distinct places, each with its own history and identity. For those living within these regions, daily life likely changed very little in response to the changing maps. Borders drawn by distant officials often mattered less than local customs, trade relationships, and seasonal rhythms. Yet, on paper, the transformation was significant. A name that once unified a vast area dissolved into a patchwork of smaller labels, each tied to specific political or geographic realities. This is one of the reasons Tartaria feels like it vanished. Its disappearance was administrative and intellectual rather than military. The war, if one can even call it that, was a war of precision over ambiguity, of measurement over myth. And like many such conflicts, it ended quietly, without leaving behind a single moment that could be marked as its conclusion. When empires fall through war, someone usually announces it. Victors declare their triumph. Treaties are signed. Dates are recorded. There is a sense that something has ended, even if the consequences unfold over many years. Tartaria has no such moment, and that absence is what fuels much of the confusion surrounding its story. The reason no one announced the end of Tartaria is simple, though not always intuitive. There was no central authority to defeat, no capital to capture, and no ruler whose surrender could symbolize the collapse of an entire system. Tartaria was not a state in the way modern empires are understood. It was a name applied from the outside, not an identity enforced from within. Because of this, there was never a moment when Tartaria could officially end. It did not sign treaties, it did not lose wars, it did not dissolve itself. Instead, the concept slowly became unnecessary. As political realities grew more complex and better understood, the broad label no longer served a purpose. This kind of ending is difficult for historical narratives to accommodate. Historians prefer clear transitions, moments when one era gives way to another. Without these markers, it can feel as though something has been deliberately hidden or erased. In truth, nothing dramatic occurred. The world simply moved on, and the language used to describe it moved along with it. From a military standpoint, this kind of quiet transition can be seen as a success rather than a failure. It suggests that power shifted without provoking widespread conflict. It implies that authority was established through stability rather than force. In many ways, this is the ideal outcome of imperial expansion, though it rarely receives the same attention as conquest. The lack of an announcement does not mean that nothing changed. It means that change occurred at a pace that did not demand attention. Borders were negotiated, jurisdictions overlapped, administrative systems evolved. Over time, the old label lost relevance, and with it, the sense that it represented a meaningful political entity. This gradual fading is uncomfortable for modern audiences because it resists storytelling conventions. There is no climax, no resolution, no single truth to uncover. Instead, there is a slow drift, a quiet reshaping of the world that leaves behind questions rather than answers. In this way, Tartaria serves as a reminder that not all historical change is loud. Some of the most significant shifts occur without spectacle, without ceremony, and without the kind of documentation that later generations expect. The absence of an ending is not evidence of a mystery, it is evidence of continuity. When we talk about empires and maps, it's easy to forget the people who lived within these changing landscapes. For them, the disappearance of Tartaria was not an event, but a process, one that unfolded slowly enough to blend into everyday life. Understanding this human experience helps explain why the transition left so little trace in memory. Most people in the regions labelled as Tartaria were not concerned with imperial labels. Their lives were shaped by local concerns: weather, harvests, trade, family, and community. Authority was often experienced through local leaders rather than distant rulers. When control shifted from one system to another, it may have altered taxation or administration, but it rarely transformed daily routines overnight. This gradualism is key. Sudden change is memorable because it disrupts expectations. Gradual change is forgettable because it feels normal. When borders hardened or new officials arrived, these developments were absorbed into the rhythm of life. Over time, what had once been new became familiar, and what had once been familiar faded quietly into the past. From the perspective of war history, this kind of transition challenges the focus on conflict. It suggests that peace, or at least the absence of war, can be just as transformative as battle. The regions once grouped under Tartaria did not need to be conquered in a dramatic sense. They were integrated through systems that emphasized continuity rather than rupture. This does not mean that the process was free of tension or resistance. Change always creates uncertainty, but without a single defining conflict, these tensions remained localized. They did not coalesce into a global war that could define the era. Instead, they dissipated over time, leaving behind a landscape that felt stable, even if it was fundamentally different from what had existed before. For listeners today, this quiet history can be difficult to accept. We are accustomed to stories with clear beginnings and endings, We want history to resolve itself neatly. Tartaria resists this desire. Its story reminds us that much of the past unfolded slowly, without witnesses who recognized its significance in the moment. As we approach the final sections, we'll turn our attention to why this kind of history feels so unsettling now, and what it can teach us about war, power, and the nature of change itself. There is a particular kind of discomfort that arises when a historical story does not behave the way we expect it to. The story of Tartaria unsettles many modern listeners, not because of what it contains, but because of what it lacks. There is no dramatic collapse, no decisive war, no single moment when everything changed. Instead, there is quiet continuity, and for a culture accustomed to clear narratives, that quiet can feel incomplete. In the modern world, we are surrounded by explanations. News cycles compress events into headlines. Documentaries promise revelations. History is often presented as a sequence of turning points, each neatly labelled and dated. We grow used to the idea that every major development must have a cause that can be pointed to, named, and summarised. When we encounter a historical phenomenon that resists this structure, it can feel as though something is missing. Tartaria challenges this expectation directly. Its disappearance from maps does not correspond to a known war, treaty, or revolution. There is no declaration that announces its end. Instead, the name simply falls out of use as understanding improves and political realities shift. For many people, especially those encountering the concept for the first time, this absence feels unsettling. The mind searches for a hidden event, a suppressed conflict, or an explanation dramatic enough to match the scale of the perceived loss. This reaction says as much about us as it does about history. We are drawn to stories of collapse because they offer resolution. A battle ends, a victor emerges, and the world moves forward in a new direction. Quiet change, by contrast, offers no such clarity. It unfolds slowly, often invisibly, and leaves behind few emotional markers. Without a clear ending, the story lingers, unresolved. There is also something deeply modern about the way Tartaria is discussed today. In an age of instant access to information, the idea that something vast could simply fade without notice feels improbable. We assume that if something important happened, it would have been recorded, shared, and preserved. Yet much of history occurred outside the spotlight, especially in regions far from the centres of record-keeping power. War history, in particular, is shaped by documentation. Battles are remembered because they generate records, orders, reports, correspondence, memorials. When war does not occur, or when power shifts without violence, the paper trail is thinner. The absence of evidence can be mistaken for evidence of absence, or worse, for deliberate concealment. Another reason the Tartaria story feels unsettling is that it blurs the line between perception and reality. Tartaria existed primarily as a concept, a name applied by outsiders to a region they did not fully understand. When that concept disappeared, it created the illusion of loss, even though the underlying societies continued to exist. This challenges the assumption that names and borders reflect fixed truths rather than temporary frameworks. For listeners today, especially those accustomed to visual media, old maps can feel authoritative. Seeing a large label like Tartaria printed across a continent gives it weight and substance. When that label disappears from later maps, the contrast can feel dramatic. But maps are not neutral mirrors of reality. They are tools shaped by knowledge, priorities, and perspective. This realization can be uncomfortable because it suggests that our understanding of the past is always provisional. What feels certain today may appear incomplete or misguided tomorrow. Tartaria reminds us that history is not a fixed story waiting to be uncovered, but a continuous process of interpretation and reinterpretation. From a calm, reflective perspective, this is not something to fear. It is something to accept. The past does not owe us clarity. It unfolded according to its own rhythms, often indifferent to how it would later be remembered. When we encounter stories like this one, the discomfort we feel is an invitation to slow down, to sit with ambiguity, and to allow history to be quieter than we expect. When we step back and look at Tartaria through the lens of war history, a different picture emerges from the one suggested by mystery and speculation. Rather than a lost empire destroyed in secret, Tartaria becomes a case study in how power can shift without the kind of conflict that usually defines historical memory. War is often treated as the primary engine of change. Empires rise through conquest and fall through defeat. Yet this view, while dramatic, is incomplete. Military power does not always express itself through constant fighting. In many cases, its greatest influence lies in what it prevents rather than what it causes. The regions, once grouped under the name Tartaria, were shaped by centuries of military interaction, deterrence, and adaptation. Steppe warfare influenced neighbouring states. Empires learned to negotiate, accommodate, and absorb rather than confront directly. Over time, this created conditions in which large-scale war became unnecessary. This does not mean that military power was absent. On the contrary, it was ever present. Forts, garrisons, and patrols maintained order. The threat of force underpinned administrative control. But because this power was stable and continuous, it rarely erupted into dramatic conflict. War, in this context, was a background condition rather than a foreground event. Tartaria teaches us that the end of conflict is not always marked by peace treaties or victory parades. Sometimes it is marked by irrelevance. When a particular way of organizing space and power no longer serves its purpose, it fades away. The absence of war is not a mystery to be solved, but a result to be understood. For students of war history, this perspective is valuable. It broadens the definition of military influence to include systems, structures, and long-term stability. It reminds us that the most effective exercise of power is not always the most visible. An empire that expands without provoking war may be more successful in its own way than one that relies on constant conquest. This understanding also reframes the idea of victory. Victory does not always involve defeating an enemy. Sometimes it involves rendering conflict unnecessary. In the case of Tartaria, the lack of a final war suggests that no decisive struggle was required. The balance of power had already shifted. There is a quiet lesson here about restraint. War history is filled with examples of destruction, but it also contains examples of avoidance. Studying these quieter moments does not diminish the importance of conflict. It deepens our understanding of how and why it occurs, and when it does not. As the name Tartaria faded from maps, the military realities that once shaped it continued under different forms. Power did not vanish, it reorganized. Authority did not collapse, it settled into new structures. The war that never happened tells us as much about history as the wars that did. Imagine living in a time when history does not announce itself. There are no headlines, no breaking news, no urgent messages carried across glowing screens. Change moves slowly, carried by footsteps, by merchants travelling familiar roads, by officials arriving quietly in small towns. This was the world in which the lands once labelled as Tartaria continued to exist long after the name itself began to fade. For most people, history is not experienced as an event. It is experienced as routine. Seasons pass. Markets open and close. Children grow older. Livestock is tended. Travellers arrive and depart. Authority, when it changes, does so gently, often without disrupting these rhythms. A new tax collector may appear. A different language may be heard in official documents. A border that once felt distant may become more defined, yet daily life continues. This is one of the reasons the disappearance of Tartaria left so little trace in lived memory. There was no moment when people woke up to find themselves suddenly part of something new. Instead, they drifted into it. The world adjusted around them while they focused on surviving, working, and resting. War history often overlooks this kind of continuity. Battles draw attention because they interrupt life. They demand participation. They create stories that are retold and preserved. Quiet transitions, by contrast, slip past unnoticed. When no armies march and no cities burn, there is little reason to record the moment. In the lands of the steppe and beyond, power increasingly came from systems rather than force. Roads mattered more than raids. Administration mattered more than conquest. Authority became something that was felt rather than seen, present in paperwork and procedure rather than banners and armour. From a storytelling perspective, this creates a different kind of history. It is not a story of heroes and villains, but of adaptation. People learn to navigate new systems without ever being told they were part of a new era. Over time, the old names lost relevance, not because they were forbidden, but because they no longer matched lived reality. Tartaria, in this sense, became a ghost of language. It lingered in books and maps while the world moved on without it. The silence surrounding its disappearance is not evidence of concealment. It is evidence of normal life continuing uninterrupted. And for a listener drifting towards sleep, there is something deeply calming in this realization. History does not always crash into the present. Sometimes it dissolves gently, leaving behind echoes rather than endings. As night settles over the steppe, the vastness of the land becomes more apparent. The horizon stretches endlessly, unbroken by walls or towers. The sky opens wide, filled with stars that seem closer than anywhere else. In such a place, the idea of borders feels abstract. Power is something distant, carried by rumour rather than presence. For centuries, nights like these passed without regard for empires. Camps were set up, fires were lit, stories were told softly, carried by the wind. The steppe has always encouraged movement rather than permanence, and that movement shaped how its people understood authority and conflict. War, when it came, was swift and decisive, but more often it was avoided. Distance itself served as protection. The difficulty of sustaining large armies across such vast terrain discouraged prolonged campaigns. Those who understood the land best held an advantage, and that understanding often allowed them to avoid unnecessary fighting. This relationship with war was subtle. Strength was demonstrated through readiness rather than aggression. The knowledge that conflict could erupt at any time often ensured that it did not. Diplomacy, tribute, and alliance became tools of survival. As empires expanded into these regions, they encountered not a single enemy, but a way of life that resisted easy control. The response was not always violence. Instead, empires adapted. They learned to coexist with the rhythms of the steppe, to govern lightly, to allow local structures to persist. Over time, this accommodation softened distinctions. What had once been outside slowly became within. Yet because this process unfolded quietly, it left few moments for historians to highlight. No final battle marked the end of independence. No treaty declared submission. Authority settled like dusk, gradually and without fanfare. In the darkness, with only the sound of wind and distant movement, the idea of Tartaria feels less like an empire and more like a memory of space itself, a reminder of how large the world once seemed and how slowly it changed. For the listener, this image invites rest. A land unconcerned with names or maps, existing simply as it is, indifferent to how it will later be remembered. Some stories do not end because they were never meant to. They shift shape, adapt to new tellers, and reappear in different forms. Tartaria is one such story. Long after the name disappeared from maps, it continued to live on in questions, in curiosity, and in the quiet discomfort of unresolved history. Modern interest in Tartaria often says less about the past and more about the present. In a world that values certainty, the idea of a story without a clear ending feels unsettling. We want closure. We want to know what happened, when it happened, and why. Tartaria offers none of these in a satisfying way. Instead, it offers ambiguity. It invites us to sit with the idea that not everything important leaves a dramatic trace, that some transformations are so gradual they become invisible, that power can move without announcing itself, and history can unfold without spectacle. This does not make Tartaria a secret. It makes it ordinary. And perhaps that ordinariness is what makes it so compelling. In its quiet fading, it mirrors countless other stories that never became headlines, never inspired monuments, and never received a final chapter. For a war history storyteller, this is a gift. It allows space for reflection rather than resolution. It invites listeners to relax into uncertainty, to let go of the need for answers, and to simply experience the rhythm of the past. As this section gently draws to a close, Tartaria remains where it has always been, not as a lost empire, but as a reminder that history is larger, quieter, and more patient than we often realize. And with that thought, the story continues, even as the telling slows, softens, and fades into rest. Long after armies stop marching, roads remain. They curve gently across plains, pass through valleys, and disappear into forests. They remember footsteps more than battles. In the lands once associated with Tartaria, these roads carried merchants, messengers, families, and ideas long after any notion of empire had faded from memory. War history often focuses on where armies fought, but roads tell a different story. They reveal where people expected to travel, where trade flowed, and where authority quietly extended its reach. A road maintained year after year suggests stability. It suggests that conflict has given way to routine, that safety, or at least predictability, has taken hold. As expanding powers moved into the steppe and surrounding regions, they invested in connection rather than confrontation. Roads allowed for the movement of goods without escorts, for officials to travel without fear, for messages to arrive without delay. Each mile of maintained road reduced the need for force. Control became logistical rather than violent. For those living nearby, these roads changed life in subtle ways. Markets grew more regular. Goods arrived from farther away. News travelled faster, though still slowly by modern standards. The world felt slightly smaller, slightly more ordered. None of this required a war to announce it. At night, when travellers rested and fires burned low, these roads lay quiet beneath the stars. They did not declare allegiance. They did not bear flags. They simply existed, serving whoever used them next. Over time, they outlasted the names given to the regions they crossed. Tartaria may have vanished from maps, but its roads did not vanish. They became part of something new without ever needing to be destroyed. This is the kind of history that rarely makes it into textbooks, yet it shapes daily life more deeply than any single battle. Listening to this story, it's easy to imagine the slow creak of wagons, the soft rhythm of hooves, the calm certainty that tomorrow will look much like today. In that repetition, power settles quietly into place. History often jumps from one conflict to the next, skipping over the long stretches in between. Yet these stretches of silence are where most people live their lives. In the regions once grouped under Tartaria, these quiet intervals were not empty. They were full of negotiation, adaptation, and unspoken understanding. The absence of war does not mean the absence of tension. Borders were tested, authority was questioned, loyalties shifted. But rather than erupting into open conflict, these pressures were often released gradually. Small compromises replaced large confrontations. Local disputes were settled without drawing in distant powers. This kind of stability can feel fragile, yet it can last for generations. When war is avoided repeatedly, it begins to feel unnecessary. People adjust their expectations. The idea of large-scale conflict fades into the background, replaced by a focus on continuity. From a military standpoint, this is not weakness, it is maturity. It reflects a balance of power so well understood that neither side feels compelled to challenge it openly. In such conditions, war becomes a last resort rather than a default response. Tartaria's quiet disappearance fits within this pattern. The silence between conflicts grew longer and longer until it became the defining feature of the region's history. By the time maps changed and names shifted, war was no longer the language through which power was expressed. For a listener resting at night, this silence is comforting. It reminds us that history is not a constant drumbeat of violence. Much of it is waiting, watching, and choosing not to act. The silence between conflicts is not emptiness, it is space. Space for life to continue, for cultures to blend, and for stories to soften with time. Over generations, memory changes texture. Sharp edges soften, details blur. What remains is not a clear picture, but an impression. Tartaria exists today, mostly in this form, as a mist of memory shaped by old maps, half-remembered stories, and the human desire for lost worlds. As names disappear, they do not vanish entirely. They linger in archives, in libraries, in quiet corners of scholarship. Occasionally, someone stumbles upon them and feels a sense of discovery, as though uncovering something hidden. In truth, nothing was hidden. It was simply no longer needed. War history usually preserves what is dramatic. Battles are remembered because they demand remembrance. Quiet change does not insist on being recalled. It fades naturally, like fog lifting as the day warms. This fading does not diminish the past. It transforms it. Tartaria becomes less a place and more a feeling, the feeling of a world larger and less defined than our own. A world where power moved slowly and names mattered less than relationships. As this story continues to unfold in your mind, it's okay if details slip away. Sleep history is not meant to be memorized. It's meant to be experienced gently, allowing thoughts to wander without needing resolution. Tartaria's final lesson may be this. Not all histories are meant to be held tightly. Some are meant to drift, to blur, and to rest quietly in the background, just beyond the edge of waking thought. And as your breathing slows and the story softens, that mist of memory can fade too, leaving only calm behind. Time does not rush, even when history seems to. It settles slowly, layering one moment over another, until change becomes difficult to separate from continuity. And this is perhaps the truest way to understand the lands once associated with Tartaria. Over centuries, authority shifted not through dramatic confrontations, but through the gentle accumulation of habit, expectation, and routine, until what had once felt expansive and undefined began to feel structured and familiar. People adapted without realizing they were adapting, responding to new systems the way water responds to a riverbed, flowing along paths that formed gradually beneath it. Military presence existed, but it rarely announced itself loudly. It was felt instead in the predictability of movement, the safety of roads, and the quiet assurance that tomorrow would resemble today. War, in this environment, became unnecessary not because conflict had been resolved in some final sense, but because it had been absorbed into the background of life, replaced by an understanding of limits and balances that everyone quietly respected. Over time, the old names lost their usefulness, not because they were erased, but because they no longer described how the world felt to those living within it. Tartaria became lighter with each passing generation, less a place and more a memory, until even that memory softened into something indistinct, carried forward not by records or declarations, but by the slow, steady rhythm of time itself, which asks for no attention and leaves behind no sharp edges, only the calm sense that things have always been this way, even when they have not. There is a moment in the life of every empire when power no longer needs to raise its voice, when authority becomes so embedded in daily existence that it can afford to speak softly, and in the regions once labelled as Tartaria, that moment arrived without ceremony. Armies still existed, but they were no longer the primary messengers of control. Instead, power expressed itself through quiet systems, through schedules and permissions, through expectations that shaped behavior without demanding obedience. This was power that had learned restraint, not out of kindness, but out of efficiency, understanding that stability outlasts fear and routine endures longer than force. In such an environment, war becomes an interruption rather than a tool, something avoided not because it is impossible, but because it is unnecessary. The absence of conflict is not accidental here. It is the product of careful balance, of knowing when not to act, of allowing structures to do the work that armies once performed. As generations passed, people no longer thought of themselves as living in a contested space. They lived instead within a quiet order that felt natural simply because it was familiar. Tartaria did not fall silent because it was defeated. It fell silent because it no longer needed to speak. Its influence diffused into the fabric of everyday life, where it could persist unnoticed, steady and unremarkable, leaving behind a history that does not shout its presence, but whispers gently to those willing to listen. Every story reaches a point where it no longer needs to continue, not because it has been resolved, but because it has said enough, and the story of Tartaria arrives at that place quietly, without insisting on a conclusion. What remains is not an answer, but a feeling, the sense of a world that changed slowly and without drama, where power moved carefully, and names came and went without altering the deeper rhythm of life. Tartaria was never a single empire waiting to collapse. It was a way of seeing space, of naming the unknown, and when the unknown became familiar, the name simply drifted away. There was no final war, because there was no final moment, only the steady passage of time smoothing edges and softening distinctions until the past blended seamlessly into the present. For the listener, there is comfort in this ending, or perhaps in the lack of one, because it mirrors the way sleep arrives, not all at once, but gradually, as thoughts loosen their grip and awareness fades gently into rest. This story does not demand to be remembered in detail. It asks only to be experienced, then released, settling quietly alongside countless other histories that shaped the world without ever needing to announce themselves, leaving behind calm instead of closure and silence instead of certainty. There is a quiet comfort in stories that do not resolve themselves completely, in histories that leave space rather than answers, and Tartaria belongs to this softer category of the past, where certainty gives way to calm acceptance. Not every chapter closes with a final line, and not every change announces itself loudly enough to be remembered, yet the absence of an ending does not diminish what came before it. Instead, it allows the story to remain open, breathing gently across time, untouched by the pressure of explanation. In the lands once gathered under this broad name, life continued without interruption, shaped more by seasons than by borders, more by routine than by rule, and this continuity is what gives the story its quiet strength. War did not need to arrive to mark a turning point, because the turning had already occurred, slowly and patiently, guided by habits rather than decisions. As generations passed, the idea of Tartaria loosened its hold on memory, not because it was forgotten, but because it no longer mattered in the way it once had. And there is something deeply restful in allowing a story to remain unfinished, to exist without needing to be solved, much like the thoughts that drift through the mind just before sleep, present for a moment, then gently fading away. If we slow down enough, history begins to sound different, not like a sequence of events, but like a quiet landscape filled with pauses, gaps, and spaces where nothing dramatic happens at all. These spaces are where Tartaria truly lives now, not in battles or borders, but in the long stretches of time between them, where people lived ordinary lives without knowing they were part of a larger story. In these moments, power is subtle, almost invisible, shaping choices without announcing itself, guiding movement without force, allowing the world to settle into patterns that feel natural simply because they are repeated. War, in this setting, becomes distant, something remembered rather than expected, and over time, even those memories soften, losing their urgency. The silence between conflicts is not empty. It is full of breath, full of routine, full of the quiet certainty that tomorrow will arrive much like today. And when history is experienced this way, it no longer feels heavy or demanding. Instead, it becomes something you can listen to without effort, something that flows past gently, like wind across grass or water along a familiar path, asking nothing in return, inviting rest rather than attention. As this long journey through quiet history continues to settle, the past begins to feel less like a record and more like a place, somewhere you can visit briefly before letting it slip away again. Tartaria rests here now, not as an empire, not as a mystery, but as a calm reminder that the world does not always change through struggle, and that absence can be as meaningful as action. Its story is not one of loss, but of release, of names loosening their grip as understanding grows, of power learning to move gently rather than forcefully, until even the memory of conflict feels distant. In this space, there is no urgency to remember details or draw conclusions, only the soft reassurance that history, like sleep, arrives gradually and leaves quietly. You do not need to hold on to this story for it to matter. It has already done its work simply by being heard, and now it can rest, settling into the background of thought where it no longer asks for attention. As awareness softens and the mind grows still, Tartaria becomes what it has always been at the end of this telling, a quiet place beyond time, where stories slow, edges blur, and rest comes naturally. As the story continues to drift, the idea of Tartaria becomes less tied to geography and more connected to the way humans remember change, because memory itself does not preserve sharp lines or official endings. It preserves feeling, and the feeling left behind by this history is one of gradual softening rather than sudden loss. Over time, what once seemed vast and undefined slowly became familiar, and familiarity has a way of dissolving mystery without ever announcing that it has done so. People adjusted to new names, new systems, new expectations without needing to mark the transition, because daily life rarely pauses long enough to reflect on the scale of its own movement. In this way, Tartaria slipped quietly into the background, not erased, not destroyed, but simply outgrown, like an old path that remains visible for a while before grass slowly covers it. War, which so often defines historical memory, receded here not because it was defeated, but because it was no longer necessary, its presence replaced by routines that carried authority more gently and more effectively than force ever could. As generations passed, the weight of the past grew lighter, carried not as a burden but as an undercurrent, something felt rather than recalled, shaping attitudes and expectations without demanding attention. The land remained, the people remained, and even the echoes of old power remained, but the need to name them as a single thing faded away, leaving behind a calm continuity that feels almost timeless. And as this quiet unfolding reaches its natural resting place, the story itself begins to loosen, no longer asking to be followed closely, no longer insisting on meaning, allowing the listener to rest within it rather than understand it, much like the way sleep arrives without explanation, gently dimming awareness until only stillness remains, and history, like breath, moves on without needing to be noticed at all. As the story finally loosens its hold, there is no need to follow anything further, no need to stay alert for meaning or direction, because everything important has already been said in the quiet spaces between the words, and now the only thing left is the gentle movement of time continuing on its own. The idea of Tartaria, which once seemed vast and undefined, no longer needs to be understood or remembered clearly, because it has softened into something calmer and more distant, like a place seen through mist, or a thought that passes through the mind without asking to be held. History itself becomes quieter here, no longer a sequence of events or explanations, but a slow, steady presence that exists whether it is noticed or not, moving forward in small, even moments that do not demand attention. There is no urgency now, no question waiting to be answered, no ending that needs to arrive, only the sense that everything continues gently, just as it always has, without pause and without concern. The past drifts farther away, not because it is lost, but because it no longer needs to be close, and the mind can follow that same path, allowing thoughts to become lighter and less distinct, settling into a rhythm that feels familiar and safe, like a long road stretching into the distance. Nothing about this moment requires effort, because the path is already there, carrying everything forward at its own pace. Breathing slows naturally, without instruction, and awareness softens without needing to be guided, as the body remembers how to rest in the same way it always has, quietly and without explanation. There is no need to listen closely anymore, because nothing important depends on attention, and nothing will change whether the words are heard clearly or fade into the background. The story does not end so much as it dissolves, becoming part of the stillness that surrounds it, blending into the quiet continuity of time passing evenly and without interruption. Thoughts begin to lose their edges, becoming less about ideas and more about sensation, about the simple comfort of existing in a moment that asks for nothing at all. The land, the people, the names, and the histories that once filled the story all settle into the same gentle distance, present without pressure, meaningful without needing to be understood. Like water moving slowly through a wide, familiar channel, everything flows without resistance, guided by gravity rather than intention, and it is safe to allow the mind to follow that flow wherever it leads. There is no destination that needs to be reached, no conclusion that needs to be acknowledged, only the quiet reassurance that rest arrives on its own when given enough space. The world continues turning softly, indifferent to whether it is observed, carrying forward countless stories that never ask to be remembered, and this one can rest among them now, complete simply by having existed. Awareness drifts in and out gently, like light shifting across a room as evening settles in, and the need to stay awake loosens without effort. The sound of the voice becomes just another part of the environment, no more demanding than distant wind or quiet movement, something that can be noticed or ignored without consequence. Time stretches here, not long and heavy, but wide and calm, offering room for the mind to slow down and release its grip on clarity. Nothing needs to be done, nothing needs to be decided, and nothing is expected in return for simply being present in this moment. The past no longer presses forward, and the future does not pull attention away, leaving only the gentle middle space where rest naturally unfolds. History becomes indistinguishable from silence, and silence becomes indistinguishable from calm, until even those distinctions feel unnecessary. The body settles into stillness the way it always has, guided by instincts older than memory, and the mind follows, drifting gently away from focus and into ease. There is no final thought to hold on to, no lesson to remember, no ending to mark, only the quiet sense that everything has found its place. Like embers fading after a long fire, warmth remains even as detail disappears, and it is enough to let that warmth linger without naming it. The story does not ask to be revisited, and it does not demand closure, because it has already blended into the background where rest lives. Awareness becomes softer, lighter, less concerned with form or meaning, until even the act of listening feels distant and optional. Everything slows without stopping, continues without effort, and rests without needing permission. And in that gentle continuation, sleep arrives naturally, unnoticed and unannounced, carrying thought away until there is nothing left to follow at all.